First of all, a great big welcome. I am Elizabeth Rolinski. I am Vice President of Global Manufacturing Engineering with Johnson Controls here in Milwaukee. So very excited that the event is held in Milwaukee this year. The topic that we're talking about, I am your moderator. The topic that we are talking about is getting people to talk about unconscious bias. So I would contend probably one of the most important and most difficult aspects of diversity and inclusion today. Because although we have come a long way, and we like to think everybody has the same opportunity and a seat at the table, and decisions are made for the right reasons across all of our companies and across our schools, that's just not always the case. Some of us have felt it, some of us have observed it, some of us maybe not, but need to learn more about it. But how you get started, how you have those conversations, when, with who, what forums, those are the things we're going to get into a little bit today with our panelists, our very esteemed professionals from various regions, and I will go ahead and introduce each of those. So first of all, we will start with Michelle Mathai. Welcome, Michelle. Michelle is a Director of Inclusion. Michelle Mathai designs, implements, and integrates global strategies, processes, and programs that drive Rockwell Automation's strategic direction and evolution of culture and inclusion. She has led significant efforts to transform the original culture and embedded inclusion into business processes to create meaningful results and lasting change. Michelle is a trusted facilitator, process consultant, and coach, and brings more than 2 decades of experience to developing talent solutions and people strategies aligned with business strategies. Michelle originally joined Rockwell Automation in 1994 and most recently ran her own consulting practice focused on talent management, strategic planning, and inclusion and engagement prior to returning to Rockwell Automation in 2015. Michelle holds a Bachelor's of Arts degree in Political Science and International Relations from University of Wisconsin-Madison and an MBA from Marquette University, Milwaukee. So many of you probably from those schools, so welcome, Michelle. Our next panelist is Susan Shillette. So Susan, that's a name many of you may recognize. Susan Shillette is Senior Life Member of Society of Women Engineers. She's been continually active with SWE for over 36 years, significantly contributing to 4 professional sections and 3 SWE regions, most notably in the area of membership. After graduating with an engineering degree from Trinity College and chartering their collegiate SWE section, Shillette was employed by Sikorsky Aircraft, a division of United Technologies Corporation. As mechanical test engineer, she was responsible for testing a variety of mechanical components and systems on helicopters and implementing company process improvements. So welcome, Susan. And Lori Parsons. Lori is a Senior Vice President at O'Brien & Gear and CEO Principal Engineer at Natural Resource Technologies, an OBG company. She has more than 30 years of experience in water resources and environmental consulting businesses. Her career began with water quality research work on the Great Lakes that led to positions with Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources in both water resource and wastewater management areas. Subsequently, the bulk of her career has been in science and engineering consulting, with a practice focused on groundwater hydraulics and environmental remediation. Early in her career, Lori joined a startup consulting firm, NRT, to establish and grow engineering services. In 2007, she became president of NRT. Under her leadership, the firm more than doubled in size locally and through addition of offices in Illinois and Michigan. She has continued to participate in technical and policy advisory groups addressing environmental regulatory change in Wisconsin. So welcome, Lori. Whoops. And there is Lori. All right, we are going to dive right in. I'm going to start with you, Susan. Why is this such an important topic?
Good morning. So biases. Biases influence how humans think and act. And unconscious bias, if you're not aware of your biases, your actions and thoughts can be adversely affected. So I think it's really important that we discuss it and we make each other aware of it.
Yeah. You guys go ahead and add in. Yep.
We just pipe in as
Yes,
we
pipe
have
in,
thoughts?
yes. Yep.
All right. I think one of the points I'd like to make, and in the business that I'm in, which is engineering and consulting, is that in our firm, we want to be a destination employer for all of you, young and, the entire population of women engineers. And so for us to have a good handle on what this is, unconscious bias, walking in the door is important to us for our desire to recruit best and top talent. That's
Yeah, and I'll just add to that too. I mean, it's an important issue because it's a very human issue. We all have bias, and bias isn't good or bad, it just is. And the more that we can understand what it is, and when it becomes good or bad is when it interrupts and impacts our decision making. And so it's such an important topic because in order to get the best decisions, make the best decisions, we need to really make sure we know how to interrupt bias when it happens and understand how that impacts our decisions and others' decisions. So it's an important topic because it's everywhere, right? Research shows across the board the impact of bias, gender bias, race and ethnic bias, LGBT bias, the impact that that has on people everywhere. And so the more that we can understand it, the more that we can recognize it, both in ourselves and in others, the more that we can have that conversations to interrupt it and make sure that we are not negatively impacting, not letting it negatively impact our decisions.
I think that's a great point that you make, Michelle, that we all have unconscious bias. I think once everybody recognizes that, it breaks down the barrier a little bit on discussion. It's not a point to be embarrassed by. So, okay, Lori, this next one, I will start with you. How do you recognize unconscious bias, be it in yourself or in others, and how do you then deal with that?
Well, I will start with saying I watched a number of YouTube videos on what is this fairly recently, I will admit, and there's some great ones out there. Some of them brought to me by our great team from our company sitting right here in the front row. Hi, you guys. Really, it starts with education and awareness and examples, because this is so unconscious. And it's not that we're doing it on purpose, but it's there, and there's small examples. For example, one that was shared with me from the organizer of this event, I have to give her the credit, Vanessa. If you, and that was presented in another SWE conference in another region by one of the keynote speakers, which is, if you are at a table, this is an example, and this is, recognizing what unconscious bias is. You're in a meeting. You've got 6 engineers and scientists around the room. Most of them, in my world, guys. And I'm the woman. And if somebody looks at me and says, "Hey, can you get notes?" So if you want to figure out, is that a bias? You then flip that back and say, no, Joe, would you mind getting notes? If there's a pause in there or just an uncomfortable feeling, that's unconscious bias. So you just think about those examples and share, and then finally we get there.
That's great. Go ahead.
Yeah. Add on to that too, because it's always easier to recognize bias in others than it is ourselves. So I'm going to challenge all of us to first to kind of flip that script and look at ourselves first and what we're doing, because we all do have bias. It's part of being human. So to increase, and there's no one recipe on how we increase our self-awareness, but the more that you can pause and take note of what's happening anytime you're engaging in a conversation with somebody, what's getting triggered for you? Are you triggered by certain type of people? Do I react a certain way to certain type of people? And I'm thinking about this. I think about, when you're a student and you have an older male professor, and you might walk in with a bias saying, oh, he's going to be harder on me because I'm a woman. I know I'm going to have to prove myself more. You walk in making assumptions based on your own experiences and what stories you've heard. And so that's human, right? So it's not bad or good, it just is. You make those assumptions. Same thing maybe coming in, working into your first job, and you have a woman for a boss. You might think, oh no, she's going to be harder on me because she's going to feel like she had to hack it, and she worked long hours, and she's not going to be as understanding of my needs as a new employee. So we come in with with judgments or assigning those stories, but it's just based on our experiences. So it's an impulse. And so the more that we can stop and reflect and ask those questions, saying, you know, is it real? Because we all have selective attention too. So then we'll try to prove to ourselves, oh, that did happen, so now that validates the assumption that I'm making. But we might not be looking at the whole picture. The more that we default to those quick decisions, the more likely bias is to happen. So when you're making those quick decisions, it's an impulse. We're going, you know, basing it on our limbic system. That's the system that keeps us safe in our brain. That tells us that if a stove is hot or is red, I'm not going to touch it. I'm going to recoil right away. That same process happens when we interact with people. Am I going to be safe or not? Is this going to be a good interaction or a bad interaction? And we make those judgments just based on how people look or and what we're experiencing right at that time. And so we really have to make that conscious choice in that decision to say, nope, I'm going to slow down this. I know what my triggers are based on experiences I've had. I'm going to slow that down. That moves to the neocortex portion of our brain, which is really part of our brain that is responsible for reasoning, to say, yes, okay, now I'm going to get more data to validate and understand that this is what the relationship is going to be like, not based on, you know, those biases, those stories of the past that I bring with me. So increasing self-awareness can really, I think, is really important, to slow down, and then that's the first step in order to then be able to take that conversation to others, so that when you see it, you can ask for a pause to redirect and have that conversation.
Fantastic. Susan.
Okay, I'm coming at this from a very different perspective from these gals. I worked at Sikorsky on helicopters many years ago. Okay, I'm a stay-at-home mom now, which I know all the bias is going to come out now about, okay, she's not a...
I'm not judging.
I am an engineer, yes I am. So when I started my stint at Sikorsky, this is back in Connecticut. It's a huge plant. The main plant is over a mile long. It's like working in a little city, okay? So picture this. There's over 12,000 employees, over 1,200 engineers alone, right? And you're a new young engineer coming out of school. And there were a lot of really blatant bias. I would look at, they'd have posters from, come to the American Helicopter Society meeting and bring your wife, right? And I'd be like, I don't have a wife, and I would joke about that all the time. And I'd say, I don't have a wife. I don't have a wife to bring. Anyway, so, and there were other moments like that, or we get in a meeting with our boss, and my boss was a terrific fellow, but he would use expressions which kind of took me aback. He would say things like, okay, we got to get in bed with these guys on this. And it kind of startled me, and I was like, oh. But then when I got to be more comfortable with them, like, I'm not getting in bed with these guys, I would retort, and kind of, and some of it I think is an educational process. You have to kind of call people on and say, hey, and you don't have to be a pain about it. Just say, hey, the next time you write the poster, you might use the word spouse. It is in the dictionary, and you might want to, use it. So, I mean, those are the types of things that but to talk to maybe a more relevant bias, I look toward our organization with SWE, okay? We just ran into it yesterday when we were doing some of the State of the SWE talks. When we talk about our organization, a lot of times we forget about that we're not all part of the business community, for instance. We forget about academia. We forget about governmental employees, all right? Instead of talking about institutions, we talk about companies. Well, not everybody works at a company. Or like myself, who is, I tell everybody, home engineering or family, because I have 3 teenagers. So you want to try and, include everybody.
Yep, that's great. I also started at a time when it was a different story than today. So, although we do have a lot to work on, I think what many of you experience today is fortunately at a different level than when we started. So we've got some stories that probably are kind of like, no way, that wouldn't happen. But yeah, still certainly things to work on. All right, the next question, let me see, where did I leave off here? Make sure... Start with Michelle. I'll start with you on this one. What can you do at an organizational level to increase awareness of unconscious bias and to improve the culture?
Great. As I mentioned, as we were talking about, the first piece of this is looking at self and kind of recognizing where I see bias in myself before you can start looking at the organization, because all of these shifts are going to take place at an individual level first. They're not going to happen until people can really make that connection to why it's happening and understand that. And so the awareness, the personal awareness, is the very, very first step before you can start looking at the institutional things that need to change. At Rockwell Automation, we really focused first, before we started going into unconscious bias training, we really focused on culture shift to understand the impact of dominant and subordinated group dynamics. And so really engaging men in the conversation was extremely important to make it easier then to start engaging in the conversations of bias and interrupt things that we saw happening and make them aware so that they could use their privilege, white male privilege, to see it happening and speak up and speak out themselves. So that culture change was really important for us because it led to a lot of courageous conversations on this topic. We moved then into training. And so training and awareness of what unconscious bias is, understanding that it is human, taking out the shame and blame of it, because bias, unfortunately, has been a word that has been, it's a four-letter word. People think, oh, it's bad. It means prejudice. It means judgment. And yes, and it also is something that we all have. So it is a part of being human. So taking out the shame and blame of it and understanding that it happens. And so together we will work to interrupt it and mitigate it when it happens. But when you do that, then, and you can accept that it's there, because accepting that it's there is kind of the hard part for some people. They don't want to admit that there's bias. Oh no, we're good. Those other people might be biased, but not us. But then once you admit that it's there, then you can start identifying the systems in which it exists and where it shows up, and start looking at each element of kind of human interaction in the workplace. So we really look at the talent management process. So everything from our recruiting systems to hiring, to developing, to choosing who goes on what projects, to promotion, performance review, all of that. You need to take a look at where bias could possibly exist, and then you can start identifying systems to replace it. So there's a question coming up right away. Is it?
Question about institutional practices that limit who we include in companies. I read an article recently saying employee referral is one of the worst ways to increase diversity, and then also keeping internships for the sons and daughters of employees is another way that we institutionalize exclusivity.
Great point.
I wonder if you have a comment on that?
I do, yeah, no, that great point. So if you didn't hear that in the back, the comment was that the practice of employee referral can institutionalize bias within a system, and I absolutely agree. Particularly if your workforce tends to be semi-homogeneous, because we tend to refer people that we know, right, and people that we hang out with, and my brother, my cousin, my best friend, my neighbor. And that's part of the system of bias that has created this institutional system of inequity, because and one of the ways we can interrupt bias is to be very intentional about making connections across difference and meaningful and authentic relationships across difference. What speaker that I once heard use the frame, whose feet are under your table? And that really resonated with me, because we all might say, oh, I've got a black friend, I've got an Asian friend. Is it a work friend? Are they in your home? Are their feet under your table? Is it an authentic relationship? Because the more that we spend time with people that are different than us, so no matter who we are, reaching out across difference is only going to help build that network so that our network of referral will become more diverse. But in current systems and natural tendency, bias by nature makes us attracted to sameness, because that makes us feel safe. And so again, it's not our fault, and yet we're responsible for noticing that and taking a look at who are we referring, and who we're referring is in our network. So then that forces us to take a step back further to say, who's in my network and why is that, and how do we interrupt that? So yeah, great point.
Excellent. All right, yeah, Lori, I'm interested in hearing from the perspective of, you're not coming from a D&I office, that type of thing. So organizational change, from any position when you're in a STEM field like this. Have you experienced things that have worked and things that haven't?
Absolutely. I do want to tag on a few things Michelle said, because it's relevant to conversations we're having in our company now, more from an observation. And so, our starting point is to understand just basic discovery. How biased are we, and what are some of the elements within that? And I find that the question that was raised is interesting, because we are noticing, and we're actively talking about it, and we're creating. In other words, we got the elephant in the room. I'm thinking about getting a stuffed elephant and saying, because if you have fun things like that allow you to talk about this, and it's not so uncomfortable, I may bring that stuffed elephant out and say, we've got a moment here, let's just talk. And how are we recruiting? We have a directive right now to stop doing what we're doing, take a step back, and even to the point where I love Madison. University of Madison, my master's is from there. Do we need to branch out and start recruiting differently than we have? That's being discussed company-wide and in all of our offices, all 20-plus offices.
And I do have to point out, there are companies that won't recruit at UW-Madison because of the lack of diversity in their student body.
And in defense of Madison, I am on the Civil and Environmental Engineering Visiting Committee, which is an advisory board to the school and to the Dean of Engineering of that branch of engineering to work on this every quarter. And I have a meeting next month. We're going to go in there and we're going to talk about the stats again and the troubles. The chancellor of the school spoke on this last year as to initiatives to, at least there's awareness, I want to say, and a little bit of defense of Matt at the Badger thing there. But anyway.
I'm a graduate too.
So, yes, so understood. So the recruiting is just one element. All of the elements that Michelle touched on is part of it, to make sure we're aware and we're changing our behavior. Now, in my estimation, and then I'm going to hand it over here to Susan soon, this is not going to be fixed easily. There are a couple of things Michelle talked about here that this relates to kind of I think she said neuroscience, sciences, and this is brain stuff. So women have this just as much as men. So I want us to be thinking about that this isn't just a guy thing. I have a sister-in-law that I talked to on this topic. She is the smartest woman in my life. Masters, a couple of masters, bilingual. She's a elementary education teacher. She shared with me, and she's extremely liberal, socially correct, and knows all this stuff. So she shared with me that she caught herself with unconscious biases because she hates math. She had to teach it. She knew it was coming through, and at elementary level, that's when it starts. This doesn't happen. I mean, so it's that early on that we begin to develop our unconscious bias. Am I right on that, Michelle? Because you're a little more read up on this topic.
No, it is natural. Everyone has it.
Well, as to making more awareness, I think having more plenary sessions like this obviously is a no-brainer, I think, to have more of these sessions. I have a SWE-specific bias that you might find interesting. As Elizabeth mentioned, I've been really active with SWE membership for many years, and have been the society membership chair and things like that. And so I try to advocate for SWE everywhere and anywhere, and I'm willing to give the pitch anytime I get the chance, whether it's in the elevator or whatever. I found that I have several friends who are women who are engineers, but they're not SWE members. And I found I had a certain bias, You know, it's like I was like, oh, I don't get it. I don't understand why they're not members. Okay. Well, I finally got up the courage to get this conversation going with some of them, and you know what they said? And it was really interesting. It blew me away. They said, you know what? So I'm not going to be a member because I can't be active with the organization. And that blew me away. I was like, but there is a mindset, and many people have it, and God bless your opinion, like, if I can't be active with it, I am not joining. And I'm like, whoa, that took my mind. And you know what, and my argument, from my perspective, is, but you don't have to be active. You don't have to be active to be a SWE member. A portion of your dues goes back to the local section to do a lot of good things. There's strength in numbers. We need that support. That's why we are a very small percentage, us SWE members, of the overall engineering population. Okay? This might look like a lot, and when we go to annual conference and you see 12,000, that's a lot, or 14,000, or whatever. But we need those other members. And so we kind of graciously agree to disagree. But it changed my bias on these women as to their thought. That is their belief. I don't believe that. I don't believe that if I can't be active, I won't join for this particular organization, okay? But that's just one example.
Yep. And I will say, just adding on to that, what I found too was the online resources, the articles, the going back and watching webinars, is just a phenomenal resource that SWE has. So even if people can't go and attend conferences, it's a great resource. So.
Well, I think you're making a big statement by being a member. I mean, you are supportive of the mission, and we still got a long way to go. 12% of engineers in the U.S. are women. 12%? It was 8% when I graduated in the 80s. That's insane. So I think SWE is more timely now than ever.
Yep. All right, Lori, I'm going to start out with you. And by the way, I have a bias when it comes to every time I look at you and you remind me of one of my friends, Janet. If I call her Janet ever, it's because I have this bias. Did I do it already? Because I caught myself almost doing it again. I'm like, all right.
And actually, I just want to call that out because that's a great way to, when you catch it in the moment and you name it, that helps normalize the conversation. Yeah. And so that really helps because we all have it, so it makes it not a bad thing, right? And because we all have that affiliation with a person, it's when people remind us of something, that's unconscious bias, right? It's just based on our experience. But when you can call it out in a positive way.
I mitigated it,
yeah,
right?
You're calling it out in a positive way. You can call it out in another way too. So yeah.
Yes, an unconscious bias can become a conscious bias. That's right. So, okay. So, Lori, whether you're an executive or fresh out of engineering school, what are the appropriate forums for discussing bias? And then the second part to that question is, how do we ensure that discussions are meaningful and impactful?
So let me back up to one thing I might have said on how you have these conversations, which is, I think, and it's been touched on here, and so my precursor is we need to make it a safe conversation, and we need to give each other permission, and that requires doing it in a high trust situation. So I'm all about building trust environments and using that in our leadership, in our growth, and having high trust in the teams creates high functioning, and that's actually just a business advantage. So if I have my business hat on, we're going to do better and perform better if we get that trust. So then if we go directly to the question, there's a couple of things I made some notes I want to say on this one, and one answer is, whether, what's the forum, where do you bring this up? All levels of an organization. It can be at the university and the visiting committee that I mentioned I'm on. It could be in our firm, professional engineering services. I want to see it discussed at the leadership level. I want to see it at the, junior level, and all the way in the middle. The whole pyramid or cylinder of the company, I like to say it's important to have it and make it comfortable. Maybe not over-discuss it. I do think it's important to get the perspective of the younger generation, because we may not know all of it, and we don't have that perspective, and we're not ingrained. So I always feel that if there's course correction on our attitude and how we're looking at bias, we can more easily make that change. Kind of like learning a language, it's much easier when you're younger. This is the same thing here, as we just realize we're learning these traits and biases very early in our lives. So I wanted to share an example of what we did recently, and it related to and being spurred by SWE in this event, in addition to bringing in some of our great talent, sitting here in the front row again. Raise your hands again. They're there. Okay. We had probably 3 times this many in the room on Thursday, and we did a workshop. And the workshop was a think tank session where we are charged with, and our give back to the company for allowing us to come together here and be together as women engineers, is that we're going to jot down on an input sheet and answer 3 questions. And as it happens, one of those questions was unconscious bias. What do we do about it? How can we discover it in our organization? And what can we do most meaningfully now as we're doing our little grassroots thing here, and the company's over here working at it from top down in corporate philosophy, and how do we want to show up? So it really takes the whole village to do it. So I think having that perspective helps. I have more to say, but I'll leave it.
No, I just wanted to say that if you're going to have these discussions, you need buy-in from the leadership or whoever's. If you don't have that buy-in, you're not going to have meaningful discussions.
Yeah.
And yeah, I don't know if I have too much more to add on that, because those are beautiful responses, and that building of trust is so important. And actually, this afternoon, I'll be talking about this topic much more deeply and in a very interactive session. So I'll put a little plug in for that. Between 2 and 3, we're really going to be practicing that, what that looks like, how you initiate that dialogue, how do you build that muscle in that. Because like anything, because there is an element of discomfort to this, like Lori mentioned before, when you've had that feeling of discomfort, something's going on. So that means even talking about it is going to mean you have to take that leap of faith and build that relationship. But we'll be practicing how to manage that discomfort, and some things that you can do to help set the stage to create that trust. And creating that safe space is really important. Being non-judgmental in the moment, even though you might feel like that was blatant bias against me and I want to call that person, to the carpet and to call them out on it. There's a way to do that really proactively, so that it is, because ultimately it's not like we want to make the other person look bad. We want to have a good solution for us and for all of us. So the more that we can do that by creating a safe space, allowing people to make mistakes, and talking about in a productive and positive way, the more we can see positive change happen. So more on that this afternoon at 2 o'clock if you want to hear more.
All right. I recently ordered the inclusion solution, I believe, the cards from SWE. I don't know, have any of you used those? Yeah. Okay. And my thought was similar to the elephant in the room, where you go, okay, this is now what we're talking about, is brings up a way to take away the awkwardness, maybe, where I pull out a card and go, okay, this is the card we're talking about today, let's have a discussion, versus just raising my hand in a staff meeting and saying, hey, So, Lori, did you have more you wanted to add before we go to the next topic? Because we've got one more topic to hit on, but other relevant things that I cut you off on there?
No, we're good.
Okay, we're good.
We need
all right.
more. We need some time for questions,
Yes,
too.
we'll save time for questions. All right, Michelle, when considering the pervasiveness of bias, does the culture of engineering as a profession pose unique challenges versus other professions like law?
Yeah. And I'm not a lawyer, so but I can tell you the research that I've learned. I've worked a lot with a woman by the name of Andrea Kramer. She's a lawyer out of the Chicago area, and she's written a book called Breaking Through Bias. And she's worked a lot with rock automation and talked about this phenomenon, particularly that relates to rock automation and our engineers. Also, I want to just refer you to a resource because it's phenomenal. There's a large white paper that was written, co-written by really Joan Williams out of the Center of Work-Life Law at the University of California. Hastings College of Law wrote this report called Climate Control, Gender and Racial Bias in Engineering, and it's specifically focusing on the 4 most prevalent types of bias seen against women and men and women of color in the engineering fields. But Andrea Kramer talks about some universal biases that tend to happen, and I think we all can probably relate to this or have seen stories or heard the research on it, but particularly in performance evaluations. Now, this is going to be a gender bias, and actually this has to deal with race and ethnicity as well. But women do tend to downplay accomplishments much more so than men. And even when we don't, even when they're written equally, women's performance reviews aren't rated at the same level as men. So she's done a lot of research on this topic, and I've seen that across, all industries. Same thing for readiness for roles. Women will apply for a job if and when we have about 90 to 95% of the qualifications. Men will apply when they've got about 50%, and they may seem as more qualified because they come in with that confidence and they can kind of spin the story on how I can do this. But women, go in with a feeling of, if I haven't accomplished all of this, I can't go for it. And so she talks about a lot about how that impacts women's careers. The report, this climate control report, will talk about just the impact of being in any male-dominated industry. So engineering, which is more typically male-dominated industry, does have some nuances that might be more prevalent than, say, the healthcare field. But the 4 particular biases that are talked about, and again, we'll be talking about it more this afternoon, are the prove it again bias, the feeling that the women and men of color feel like they have to work harder to show what they can accomplish. The tightrope bias, where we have this kind of a narrow line, and this is sometimes called the Goldilocks syndrome too. Again, this impacts both men and women of color and women in general. We can either be seen as too hard, too soft, too feminine, too masculine. So it's a kind of a tight line. But then 2 biases that particularly impact women are maternal bias, that maternal wall feeling of what mothers bring to the workplace, or if they're committed to their family or not. And the tug of war, which is the bias that even women have against each other, particularly in STEM-related fields when it feels like there's not that many roles at the top, and so we are kind of in competition with each other. Research has shown that even men, white men in engineering fields, feel that that they are being biased against more, that women have more advantages, and so they have more of a negative connotation, and nor do they want to admit that there's bias. So that's much more prevalent in STEM fields than it is in other fields such as law. Men and male lawyers think that there's not, that doesn't really impact them as much. And the other statistic that I thought was pretty interesting from the report was that that men in STEM fields are more reluctant than other fields to accept evidence of gender bias. So they either think that women are advantaged or they think it doesn't exist. And engineering by trade, people that are in STEM fields do tend to do so much work, so much is based on logic that they spend a lot of time thinking just about the head piece of it, the logic piece of it, and it's like, nope, we're all sitting at the table, so of course there can't be bias here, as opposed to really making that head-heart connection, which is why at Rockwell Automation we've spent a lot of time focusing on head-heart connection so that people can understand that human element and start recognizing that that does happen.
Great.
That was a long response. So.
Either of you want to add? No, that was fantastic. Go ahead, Susan.
I mean, obviously, engineering as a profession poses unique challenges because of the numbers. I mean, the lawyers and doctors have upped their percentage of women over the years, and we're still, I think, way behind the 8 ball in terms of numbers of women in engineering specifically. I challenge you to ask questions. Don't be afraid to. I remember when I started working, one of the biggest reviews, so I'd go for my performance review with my boss, and one of the comments he'd make all the time was, well, you're too nice. You're too nice. And I'd walk away from that going, I don't know what the hell that means. Too nice? But after a couple of years, I kind of, I thought about it some more, and I said, you know what? I'm going to go in there and I'm going to call him on it. I'm just going to ask him about it. I went in and said, listen, okay, you're telling me I'm too nice. Now, if I'm doing too much outside of my job description, I'm doing too much for other groups or something, and that's a critical judgment. That is a critique that I can accept, okay? But if it's just a personality thing and I'm too nice, you know what, I hate to say it, but I'm not gonna turn into a bitch overnight. I mean, I am what I am. So if you don't like, I'd prefer that you do not mention it every time in the performance review, and he never said it again. So I challenge you, if something feels awkward, try to talk about it. I know it's not always easy to do that, and biases, filter in, but, talk about it with other people, too. Talk about it with your coworkers or your classmates. It's like, is this a good thing? What does this mean? How would you handle it?
I'm going to silver lining this one. So it could be worse. So this was the hardest question for me as I gave it thought, and had expressed that to our esteemed moderator when we launched here. But I thought yes and no would be my answer. Do we have challenges in the engineering? Absolutely, because it's a male-dominated field, and we all know it. So beyond that, the unconscious bias affects all of us, so we always want to keep that in mind. But if we think about the fact that we are all professionals, and maybe if we look at it as a human element, this is a human element and an attribute that we have because of the nature of who we are. And so I don't know that it's overly instructive to focus on whether it's an engineering issue. I might say that I think more of it as a challenge for the gender, but I don't, I'll defer to Michelle. You probably have some thought on that. And it is in all professions, and there are other professions that have more challenges on this than engineering does. If you think about law enforcement and some of those types of professions, the hurdles are going to be a lot higher in those. So the one thing I did want to mention, though, in terms of kind of some stats that I ran across and share, is that the problem, this is not fixable overnight. We know it. This has been, all of our history that there are unconscious biases. I think it's great that you can Google today and find, tens of pages on this topic. And I think you were referring to that, as a resource. I want to share one resource that I ran across, which I thought, okay, I don't agree with this one. And it went as follows. The definition, if you look up a definition, you could pull words. Okay, unconscious was comatose, paralyzed, senseless. And bias could be bigoted, intolerant, unfairness. And so the speaker in that case said, do we all want to be senseless, intolerant bigots? So that'll get you going. But I don't think this is really quite that. So if you run across that one, you could probably just go past.
That's great. All right. We have left time for questions here. If you guys are ready for questions, we'll open it up. Yeah. Yeah, we do have a mic coming to you.
Oh, sure.
Hi there. My name's Farrah Sears from UW Stevens Point, and my question is, do you think it's morally correct to use bias to your advantage if given the opportunity?
Can you say more? Can you say more on that?
Sure.
Yeah.
So my example is, in certain situations, since we are such low in numbers with our program, I feel like I've been given opportunities based on my gender, as opposed to maybe someone that deserves it more, or I can see someone being favorable to me because of my name, like Farrah Fawcett, things like that. So if given the opportunity, is it morally correct to accept it even though you feel like it might be a biased comment or opportunity?
Great question.
Okay, so yeah, no, thank you for furthering the explanation on that. So what you're saying is you feel that you have had some advantages, perhaps because people have been giving you a positive bias, where there might be others who would deserve it as well, right? Okay. So yeah, so very interesting question. And this is, certainly, and we see this in STEM, that there is, in fact, there's research in this, even in this document, that there is kind of more of a propensity to focus and look at women and men of women of color and hire them, because there is so much effort put on trying to encourage more women to go into STEM fields. So there's absolutely is something that is an effort and something that's talked about a lot. However, does that give you an unfair, is that unfair? I would argue no, because what all of these efforts have been done to create more equity. And so where there are, where white men, for example, have that natural networking, natural ability to connect with the higher level leaders who are typically white men as well, the extra efforts given to or offered to women and men of women of color to help develop isn't about giving them an unfair head start. It's about trying to help level the playing field and trying to focus the attention where it's deserved. Now, when you see, if you look across and say, there's somebody else who maybe deserves a chance too, that's how you can use your privilege to raise others up. And that's such an important point, and actually you kind of alluded to it as well, when we look at, especially as white women, and reaching across difference, and how we can help elevate African American women, Asian women, Latina women, because all of these things with bias, once you start painting color on it, it's harder. It's harder and it's worse. And research shows that. So if even in the workplace, white men, they can relate to white women much more easily than they kind of go there first, then to African American men, and then to Latina men, and the Latino men, and then African American women are at the very bottom of the relatability scale. And so as a white woman, how can you reach across difference? How can you say, hey, let's give Juanita a chance to do this too, or hey, could I partner with Darcy on this, because she could bring. I think I would really value her ideas on this project too. So it's not a moral question for you, but it's more of a how can you use, when people are giving you the opportunity, how can you use that to help elevate those other women around you and men and women of color around you. So
Being a positive advocate.
Absolutely.
Right. Thank you.
Any other thoughts?
I just have one additional assignment for you. So, so I agree, okay? Go for it. But I would encourage you to really dig in on the basis and the fabric of the company in question. Are they really looking at your technical skill, and is that a match? Because you would not want to, in that circumstance, set yourself up for a future failure. And so you need to be comfortable that you have met the standard of what is being looked for from the technical and skill set. If there is another goal that layers on top of that, that's a goal, and I think that should be embraced, and then be the advocate.
I'm good. I'll just add on to that, because that's exactly how I think I maybe got over it and moved on, was asking myself that question, because it then, if the answer was, yeah, I am qualified, even though it seemed like maybe they wanted the team that was getting this leadership opportunity or whatever to look diverse, and I was the one woman they could pick, it would bring those exact questions to my mind. But then I would go on comfortably if I sat down and analyzed it like that and said, yeah, I guess I do have the skill set, the background, the ability. So I'll move on and stop worrying about it.
I could throw a question back to the audience here. I had the same question, and it related to our hiring practices. And as recently as Thursday, we rolled out the red carpet for a Black a woman engineer. And I felt like, are we going overboard here? I mean, this is a lot. She was in 2 offices. We had a lot of meetings with her. But the fact of the matter is, when I discussed it with the team and the recruiting team, she was top in terms of her technical, and so we ended up, bringing her up from Chicago and would like her to join our Milwaukee office. And so it met the standard of care, and I did have to ask myself the same question. Are we overdoing it? Because you want to be equitable in how you approach these things. But to that end, I felt, so you do want to check yourself. Are we going overboard on this? And I think it's a fair question both ways. Are we, and as you as a prospective candidate, also
Great point.
advantaged?
And if I could dovetail on to, it's such, thanks for sharing that story, because organizations do themselves a disservice when they choose people just because they feel like, oh, let's give them a chance or let's try this. That's not what it's about. It's about always hiring the best talent, always having the best talent, and removing the barriers that for the best talent to get in your door. And you remove those barriers by addressing that there's bias, there's real, and so we need to recognize that and strip that away so that bias doesn't get in the way of hiring the absolute best talent, hiring who we're most comfortable with because it's somebody who looks like me or acts like me. So because the best talent might be somebody who is the complete opposite of who I am as the decision maker. So yeah, absolutely, that the knowing that you're making sure that you always have the best talent, and that the more diversity of thought you have in the decision making ensures that you get that best talent, ensures that you make those best decisions.
Right. Okay.
Working for Rockwell Automation for the last 20 years, I don't know if we're ahead of this as a company on this topic, if we're behind, but how many of you have actually done a self-assessment on your unconscious bias? And I'm hoping Michelle can help reference. I can't remember if it's academia or if it was a consulting firm, but in one of our lunch and learns in Cleveland, they referenced a case study that you can go on the web and do a self-assessment on like age or gender. There's probably about 12 different topics, and you just flip if it's male or female, young, old. Do you know what I'm referring to, Michelle?
Implicit association test.
Yes.
That's a resource that's available to anyone if you Google implicit association test, done by Harvard. Dr. Banaji, who I actually had the privilege of meeting a few weeks ago, so it's like my seeing my rock star.
Was that a plant for you?
Yeah, no, it was definitely not. I don't think you knew that, but it was. But she developed. She was on a team of researchers at Harvard University that developed this test, which is a great way to bring awareness of bias, that your personal bias, and then to start a conversation with somebody else about it, about what it means. Free on the web.
Yeah, I would think another great way for a team or a staff to start the discussions, right? I mean, go take it. They don't have to share the result with others, but then have an open discussion about it, because usually what I hear from people who take it is they're pretty surprised with their results.
Yeah.
Can you say that again? I see a lot of pens moving. The reference to
The implicit bias.
I was just going to ask you to repeat that.
Yeah,
It's from Harvard.
it's called the implicit association test. And so if you just Google implicit association test, and you'll see Harvard University there, and it'll take you right to their website. And you have to sign a couple of disclaimers saying that you might not be happy with what you see, and that they won't share. They collect it, but it's not shared associated with your name at all. So, but it really is compelling, and even when I took it, your immediate reaction is, well, this can't be right. This can't be right. This can't be that bad. But it's really, it's just a way to, again, normalize it, to pull it out so that you can have a conversation about it and what it means.
All right, we've got several questions back here, and I think we had some up front here, too.
All right, so question about the counterculture that sometimes develops when there's a diversity effort at a company. So a company is doing a diversity inclusion effort, and then you start to hear the conversations from the male engineers being a white male engineer is an endangered species with all this diversity stuff going on. How do you deal with that counterculture?
We just recently had discussions on that, so I'll add in and pass it on. But at some point we realized that might be happening and started to worry, and then began to shift our focus on the culture of inclusion. And although the numbers are important, and behind the scenes we were still looking at the numbers, we weren't talking about the numbers as much. We were talking more, and consciously more, about our culture of inclusion, about unconscious bias. And I think it has helped tremendously, because now all of a sudden that counterculture of the endangered species, like you said, or if I'm a white man, I'm never going to get promoted in this company, so I might as well leave. That kind of background noise has really settled down for us.
And I'll try to give you just a quick snapshot on this, and I'd be happy to talk more later offline about what we've done at Rock Automation, because that we really flipped the script on how we go about culture of inclusion, because we started with white men. So many diversity and inclusion efforts focus on women and men and women of color, which ultimately leaves white men out, leaves them feeling alienated from this, means that they're not part of the solution. It's you guys figure out what you want to do and let us know, and or leaves them feeling like it's about them and not me, and I don't have a chance now. So it's just, you need to start the conversation with men are part of men are a diverse group. And men don't often think of themselves as a member of a group. They think of themselves as individuals. So we have really focused about what it means to be a white man, and the whole concept of white male privilege, dominant group dynamics. And again, it's so much of traditional diversity and inclusion training has put so much shame and blame on white men that why would they want to be part of the conversation? Why do they want to be put on the spot or look dumb or look racist or sexist? Who would want that? So it's really about taking a step back from that, saying you are part of the diverse equation, and your view on this matters as well, and we need to partner with you. And so it's not shame and blame of white men. It's helping, certainly the education, understanding what white male privilege is, and once you know that you have that, it's not, and privilege is not about what you have, it's about what you don't have to navigate. And putting it that terms really, really helps them understand, okay, it's about what do I as a woman have to navigate that you as a man don't? What does an African American woman have to navigate that I as a white woman don't? So when we notice our privilege, it's about how do we use that honorably. And using that honorably means that we'll be willing to engage in that conversation. Now, just to fast forward, what we've done, yes, of course, not all men are like, yeah, this is great, let's do this. And so what we've done with the resistors, that's not where we start. Because there's going to be some men who never get on board. They're all, they're going to push back on this. But what is really important in this process is to find some allies. And you will find allies out there that want to engage in the conversation. And there's no better advocate for you, white men than another white man. So then it takes the ownership off of you to try to tell the story and to spin why this is important, why we should talk about it. But you've got a white male ally that is willing to talk about, hey, this matters and why this matters and how it's impacted his ability to lead, because white men have skin in the game on this. It impacts their ability to lead if they don't understand this topic. And so leveraging that relationship, I've found that will help move the needle. We've also done courageous conversations with white men, bringing white men together to talk about how do you feel about this focus on inclusion? What do you feel like it means to you? And giving them a forum to have a voice. Because if they feel like they just have to say the right thing, then their heart is not in it. Then they're just going through the motions and checking the box. Until you can have really authentic conversations, you can't get ahead of that, and you have to be willing to hear what they have to say. So again, when they do talk about, I feel like I'm not going to have a chance, your response can't be, well, how do you think I've felt for the last 20 years? You have to meet, you have to meet them where they are and talk about, well, what does that mean for you? What do you think, how does that make you feel? How do you, what do you want to do with that? And how do you think we could work together so that you don't feel like you're being alienated and I don't feel like I'm being alienated?
Great advice. I wish I was taking notes through that, so I'll have to go back and watch the video. We have time for a couple more, so.
Okay.
Got one right here.
Hello, my name is Luisa, and I'm part of the produce section. So recently, I've gotten this asked twice when I say that, oh yeah, I'm part of the Society of Women Engineers, and I got the response, oh, so is there a society of male engineers?
Heard it too, yeah.
So, and it also happened with a social event that we were planning. Oh, we're planning like mechanical engineering women's social. So is there going to be a men's social too for mechanical engineering? So how do you address these kind of questions that are on an immediate kind of basis? So we talked about like where to talk about bias and like these open spaces, but sometimes you're cornered into talking about it and then you start asking the question, should I question them at that point? Is this something that I should just let it slide? How to address it? How to address that immediate like prejudice, that immediate like what to do?
Oh, I so got this one. So glad you asked. All right, here's the deal, okay? First of all, you got to remind them of the numbers, okay? You've had your club for umpty years now, you guys, okay? That's the wrong term. We allowed men to become members in SWE in the 70s, okay? You don't know where you're going to get support for SWE, okay? I remember one instance, we were reviewing resumes at work, and my boss came across a resume from a fellow male who had SWE on his resume, and he knew I was a SWE member, and he came to me and he was like, well, what's this? And I explained it to him, and he understood, and we ended up hiring the guy, and that was cool. So that was kind of a learning experience. And when I was down in the Charlotte section, I was actually at an awards ceremony, and there were some fellows. We were giving out an award to a fellow, among other awards, and his colleagues were there, and I got talking with one of the gentlemen, and he was so enamored by what we did at SWE, he ended up joining the group. And I found out a couple of years later, he actually became president of the Charlotte SWE professional section, which I thought was phenomenal. So you don't know where you're going to get support from SWE. And I get this all the time from guys on campus. They're like, well, why would I want to be a SWE member? I said, damn it, why wouldn't you want to be a SWE member? I said, first of all, and we got to put a membership plug in here, but the C2C membership, collegiate to career membership, $50 your entire undergraduate, graduate, and a first year as a professional. People, you cannot beat this deal with a stick. Almost, 99% of your people, what is that? A couple trips to, Starbucks, how many cell phone bills? $50? That's nothing, people. We charge $49 for one webinar for a non-member. Let's go here, okay? I tell guys, I said, listen, what does this say to me to see SWE on your resume? It tells me you're supportive of women, you're not afraid to be different. If anything, it's a conversation starter, right? I mean, we're in this together with that. Yes, the main focus and the mission for SWE, yes, we want more women in the workplace and in the classroom, but we need everybody. We need everybody's support. And so does that help? Does that help give you some talking points as to why? And the advantages of SWE, like I said, even if you can't be active, a portion of your dues goes back to your local section to do a lot of really good work. So if you're tied up in other organizations or whatever, be proud to be part of this organization. There's a lot to go on there.
Did you either of you want to add? Go ahead.
I'll just, I'm just going to give you a little more a boots on ground example and of how you could approach this. And I'm probably going to oversimplify, but I've led a lot of change in my organization, and I'm intending to do more of that in the new organization I'm with now. And so my change management training kicks in here. So I'm going to simplify into 3 buckets. When you want to influence somebody, you may, and this is also a conscious bias of mine. So because this comes up a lot, well, is there a men's society? If there are, and you want to be positive, so you don't want to go negative on this or try to convince anybody. You want to take it forward. I think Michelle was saying some of that. There are three types out there. Simplification. The wait and seers are in the middle. I'm already there with you, and then the resistors. So this person is a resistor, so I'm judging him. And if you can find, I'm already there with you, like the guy who joined SWE, you could, in the organization or the circumstance you're in, just one suggestion would be to say, I'd like you to talk to so-and-so if you have any questions about the value of this, and it's another guy, and so go do that and inform yourself. And so that could be one way, is just to tag him with, if he's a wait and seer, there's hope. If he's a resistor, there's probably not, but tag him to, I'm already there with you.
Go ahead.
And I just want to add one more thought, because I get that a lot from even, not as much anymore, thank goodness, but before we did all of our education, but early on, and even just with affinity groups, so, Professional Women's Council, African American Professional Network, and our Professional Women's Council just celebrated 25 years, but I remember early on, men would say, well, can we start a Professional Men's Council? And so, when there's the kind of the snarky comments, there's something there, and there's something triggered for them, and so it's a great opportunity for a courageous conversation to find out what would you want to accomplish by that? What do you think that you need? And again, giving them a voice. And I've had men in my office just so angry about, for example, our LGBT policies and practices to make an inclusive work environment for LGBTQ employees. And the straight white man said, I feel like I'm being discriminated against now. And so instead of resisting that, I said, well, tell me how. Tell me, well, because I don't believe in any of this. I'm like, okay, how is that impacting you? Well, I just don't like it. I'm like, well, so have you experienced discrimination because you have a different point of view? No, but I can just feel it's coming. I said, okay, the second it starts happening, the second you start feeling discriminated against, you come and talk to me. Because this is about creating a safe workplace and an equitable workplace for everyone. And so everyone should feel safe when they come here. They should feel that they have a fair chance. That's what this is about. And so meeting them where they're at. A comment like, why isn't there a men's group? It just really kind of displays the lack of understanding about privilege and who has access to power. Because that's really why these affinity groups form, right? Because the leaders of an organization largely in corporate America, which are white men, have a natural affinity to other white men. And so how do we create forums to create more access to power? And the only way to do that is to create that community and to call out the bias and the inequities that exist, and to create the conversations and create the access that isn't naturally given to members of the subordinated groups.
That helps a lot. These questions have been fantastic, and this discussion and the advice has been fantastic too. Unfortunately, we are out of time, so I know some of you didn't get a chance to answer or ask your questions, but some of you probably have to get to a next forum. But if you do want to stop up here, if some of the panelists are around, we can continue some of that discussion. But thank you very much, Susan, Lori, Michelle. This has been fabulous. Thank you to all of you. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon.